One single human warship emerged from warp into the furious battle. The explosion stopped. The rival fleets froze. At that moment, alarms blared from every sensor. Could one ship turn the whole war? Allies sighed in relief. Enemies cursed in fear. The war had just shifted. Humanity had arrived. Now in the beleaguered star systems, news of the human warship's arrival was greeted with a silence born of disbelief. Well into the future, many alien commanders thought they had humanity's capabilities cataloged neatly. Their wars, which took place over decades, had compelled several civilizations to build up their military stockpiles. But none had prepared for a human vessel that could slip undetected past entire front lines. Then came the surge, as advanced sensors reported an enormous energy spike compared to standard battleship readings. That shattered the assumption that humans were still behind the region's major powers. Leaders of fractious factions put their never-ending feuds on pause to deal with the new menace. But the fact was, craft by craft, outpost by outpost, the same grim data repeated. One ship, no visible propulsion, shield harmonics that made standard scanning function take a vacation, and weapon power above regular dreadnought numbers. That alone would be concerning, but the more pressing fear stemmed from the warship's blunt unpredictability. Its flight path, no one could predict. Fleet upon fleet scrambled, dispatching scouting wings to find and intercept. Each time they tried, there was no reliable fix. The warship appeared to have the ability to change frequencies, cloaking methods, and jump trajectories at will. Command rooms perched over besieged worlds, alien admirals huddling around hollow displays. They knew their own fleets were overstretched, embroiled in heated battles over resource-rich planets. To muster enough ships to face this new arrival, other battles had to be stopped. Some alliance leaders wanted a temporary truce across the board, fearing if the human craft hit any capital, it would destroy it on its own. But uniting sworn enemies would be a Herculean task. Distrust ran too deep. Each faction feared that as it pursued the human warship, rivals would take advantage of the lull to capture territory. Elsewhere, smaller outposts reported panic from the remote edges of the sensor scans, mysterious ghosts. Could these be subvessels, escort drones, or even illusions from the human craft's stealth suite? No one knew. Every second provoked greater speculation. The uncontainable threat of a single ship able to turn entire fleets obsolete sapped morale. Some of the frontline troops thought the human ship must be carrying a doomsday device. Others argued that it was a ruse, an elaborate deception. The confusion only grew. The tension spiraled, certain alien officials said, recalling early glimpses of humankind's resilience. Historically, humans realized success despite gaps in resources and technology through while. Over thousands of petty skirmishes, humans demonstrated an uncanny ability to bend under pressure. Now, that guile may be embodied in a single warship, honed beyond recognition by Earth's tireless engineers. Those who once derided Earth's gradual evolution were left dealing with fear. If humans really had evolved so far, no fortress or blockade could hold. The great powers of the galaxy saw that in a conventional conflict, they could gun down lesser species. But they had never encountered an adversary operating on completely new principles. Fragmentary intelligence isolated the human warship as potentially incorporating hybrid reactors or some innovative scheme for inertial dampeners granting it unmatched acceleration. Others theorized advanced quantum computation for firing solutions, allowing it to fire at multiple threats simultaneously. Whatever the reason, each rumor fanned dread. They were battling a machine out of all normal fathoming. Yet pride made many admirals swear to hold the line. They figured that, if it came to that, the warship would submit to sheer numbers. Fleets prepared massive ambushes, marshalling cruisers, carriers, and heavy gunships. In fragile truces, fighting parties added troops to a common defense. For observers, the question was whether such an ill-at-ease coalition would be able to get its act together. But fear was an effective motivator. If the craft took out them one at a time, they were all toast. The reports of the earliest skirmishes were always cut short, ending with the sudden vanishing of the human warship and the alien vessels surviving nothing but smoldering wreckage. With each defeat, it underscored the huge gap in capabilities. Shock rippled outward. The war zone's battered fleets, engaged in past campaigns of not so much local grudges raw in numbers, now blinked up at the Fontenelle question. Could they as one summon enough armament to thwart this David Copperfield of an open sea intruder? Demands for answers grew in every corner. Was this warship an invading spearhead, or a rogue champion? Did it come to exact a settlement, were to annihilate everyone who opposed Earth. And so the galaxy hung on a knife's edge, waiting to see which way the unstoppable craft would go. The craft itself refused to talk as well. Just the fact of its presence told an inarguable story. The conflict that had once ripped these stars apart was about to change in ways nobody knew to expect. And as tension reached its height, all eyes turned to the horizon, where that unstoppable force would eventually strike. Aboard the Leviathan human ship, a group of disciplined operators readied the next phase. The mission, years in preparation, bore the hopes of every human settlement scattered through the stars. Those colonies had lived for far too long under the threat of alien incursion looming overhead, their resources devoured or their independence violated. This warship represented mankind's shared determination to never again be enslaved. Sealed in the ship's briefing chamber, the senior strategists pored over final mission details. The vessel was constructed not just to astonish the galaxy, but to act as humanity's final deterrent. By acting in the biggest theater of war, the Earth hoped to show that it could not thereafter be ignored. Every weapon system aboard, supercharged rail cannon, advanced missile arrays, energy lances, exhibited technical leaps templated from generations of hardship. The warship was Earth's final card in a rigged cosmic game. The crew knew that even the strongest vessel could not defeat the countless forces in the region on its own. But the plan only needed to hit hard, break dreams of safety, and impose negotiations on Earth's terms. If the galaxy knew that humans could unleash irresistible force at will, entire alliances would rethink how they interacted with Earth. The aim was to break the cycle of ruthless demands that claim human lives year after year. Not everyone aboard viewed it as a pure show of force. Others thought the warship had a more benevolent mission. Maybe it has come to forge peace in a world of war, to protect innocent worlds caught in its crossfire. Others argued that this was the only way Earth would ever have an equal footing, using fear if necessary. Still, no one could be in doubt about the moral gravity of unleashing unstoppable force on a war-ravaged region. The line between liberation and devastation became blurred. As the warship swooped deeper, details streamed in of desperate mobilizations. Every faction in the war zone prepared to fight, putting local resentments aside to try to halt the unstoppable intruder. The craft's pilot pored over star charts, sifting through the points of strategic nerve. The strategy: show up where the biggest forces gathered, demonstrate overwhelming firepower, then disappear before a coordinated trap could be laid. Successive stings of that scale would shatter the war zone's older alliances, with Earth the key negotiator. In secret compartments lay an advanced propulsion system said to fold local space. This enabled near-instantaneous hops to nearby sectors, bamboozling pursuers. Combined with the warship's powerful shield array, it was still resistant through multiple angles of attack. Crew members made dark jokes in silence. No fortress was safe. There was no warning when the unstoppable could come to the doorstep of a starbase. That confidence was a welcome counterweight to the crew's simmering tension. Some speculated whether the warship might first deliver its own broadcast, a last warning that it was time for warring factions to stand down. But mission briefs emphasized that no direct message was to be transmitted until a mission-critical vantage was secured. The surprise attack, and the psychological effect of unstoppable sightings, became the basic foundation of Earth's plan. Every second of bewilderment among alien fleets afforded the warship increased superiority. Near a major node in the star lanes, the warship's engines went dark into stealth mode. The pilot input coordinates for an impending showdown, searching for the densest concentration of enemy dreadnoughts. With so many factions lined up against them, success came down to timing. If they belted one big area and pulled out fast, radiating shockwaves could flood the whole region and leave enemies reluctant to assault any human land ever again. Final system checks show green. Crewmen manned advanced gunnery stations and loaded shells. Defense troops prepared interception drones. Tactics experts drew up routes of retreat, should the unstoppable face being pinned by the overwhelming numbers. Fear linked arms with grim determination. This was the Ukraine project's best shot at influencing the war and the galaxy's future. The pilot depowered the atmosphere thrusters with a silent nod. Outside, wreckage from previous fights swirled around, a testament to the disorder engulfing these star systems. And now, that chaos had met a new champion. The invincible warship pressed on, the last hope of Earth gilded on its hull, chained down and ready to unleash a deafening statement. Humankind had come to balance the scales. In a matter of moments, the opening strike would begin, and the war, long at a stalemate, would change irrevocably. An armada of alien battleships hovered above a contested planet, filled with much-needed resources. These fleets, which belonged to some of the major powers locked in a bitter stalemate, had struck an uneasy détente to defend their claims. When far-off sensors spotted the human warship bearing down on them, rivalry gave way to panic. Crews set aside old animosities and integrated fire control networks, determined to intercept the unstoppable invader. All gazes fixed to the churning abyss where the sensor arrays said the warship should appear. Then, in a silent explosion of distortion, the craft materialized at the fringes of the battleship formation. Sirens sounded from every deck. The Allied defenders poured out beams, torpedoes, and rail salvos that formed a violent storm of annihilative energy. A heartbeat later, the invulnerable warship's shield flared, absorbing or deflecting the onslaught with an eerie glow. The pilot twisted the craft, darting in between the thickest arcs of fire. It barely moved as observers tracked it. With finely tuned bursts from its thrusters, it glided deeper into the formation, turning raw chaos into a competitive edge. Allied battleships could barely avoid crashing into each other and had temporary blind spots. If anything, the Unstoppable took advantage of those openings, handing out punishing blows to estimated targets. Rail cannons thumped, hurling hypersonic slugs that tore great holes in battleship armor. Several ships detonated in catastrophic chain reactions that blasted apart nearby vessels. Even the most practiced alien captains marveled at the Unstoppable's precision. Tactical sensors attempted to adjust, but the warship's jamming pulses thwarted efforts to coordinate a unified defense. Two carriers sent out waves of fighter craft, hoping to overwhelm the Unstoppable with overwhelming numbers. But the warship's close defense lasers smoked through them in a lethal lattice of beams. The few that lived long enough to fire missiles had their warheads jammed or commandeered mid-flight and returned on their own Alsatians. The Allied lines shook with a wave of internal explosions, each defeat breeding new confusion. A war barge, driven to desperation, fired its experimental energy cannon, an unreliable weapon, in the hope of breaking through. The beam was as wide as a capital ship, gouging a swathe across space, ensuring that the Unstoppable would have to increase shield output greatly. For a brief moment, the hull grinded to a crawl, the shield whined under the load. I've known the Allied ships seize the opportunity, unleashing secondary broadsides. Looking to the future, observers dared to hope the Unstoppable might falter. But the craft's advanced reactor fired on all cylinders. The shield was a red-hot glow, and yet remained. With one last burst of force, the immovable extricated itself to unleash a storm of spatial torpedoes on the warcraft. They avoided partial shielding and targeted critical reactors. Within a furious split second, the barge detonated inwards, scattering molten shards throughout the Allied columns. The impervious rained down on the wave beyond, protection field strobing but intact. Alien admirals understood the tide had turned. Their forces, though in vast numbers, were outclassed even in a pitched battle. The relentless rained down blow after blow of surgical hits. However the defenders adapted their shape, the human craft found gaps, shredding them with minimum risk. Hulks of burning ships drifted in orbit around the planet. Life pods shot outward in flurries, which could only mean the defenders were in full retreat or had to desert ship. The chaos was at the heart of it all, an Allied flagship anchoring the formation as it battled to coordinate battered lines. The uncontained zeroing in on the flagship's lingo pivoted to deal a crippling hit. It bored in, regardless of the last-ditch barrage, over heavy covering fire. The Unstoppable's 4 cannon boomed, punching through the flagship's heart. Explosive forces ripped apart the mighty vessel from the inside. Escorts that survived fled screaming. When the final barrage of the Unstoppable ceased, the battlefield was a smoldering wasteland. Of the Allied dreadnoughts, half were sunk or disabled. The others limped off, engines on fire. The Unstoppable skimmed through the drifting wreckage of the others, searching for any active threat. None dared retaliate further. Silence fell where the industry's invincible had turned on their heel and left. Observers of war from afar began to sense that the conflict had shifted. For the first time in millennia, an outside force had broken the war zone's prime line of defense. All across alien communication networks, shock froze entire fleets. The show of the unstoppable silenced petty feuds. Factions that had once boasted of their martial might were confronted with the truth that humanity, untested by great wars until now, had jumped higher than all had predicted. The moment when the inevitable arrived, the war did shift, indeed. In a single engagement, it had demonstrated unstoppable might that made any local coalition insignificant. Tens of thousands of alien crew members recoiled from their brutality over those few minutes. In the wake of that initial showdown, bloodied survivors sent out distress signals. Some demanded a united front. Others insisted on surrender, then and there. The Invincible, having ended the encounter, disappeared in a flash of superior thrust. Its last jump left only torn lines of blighted cruisers and the distant echo of rail slugs. For those who beheld the fury of the Unstoppable, no illusions were held. The conflict had a new champion, and its name was humanity. Stunned by the Unstoppable's crushing victory, factions of the war zone raced to recalibrate their strategies. Breaking panic coursed through war councils. If they were unable to stop the unstoppable warship's advance, annihilation of entire planets was at risk. Under severe pressure, the world's greatest powers, once bitter rival, scrambled to negotiate a grand alliance. They combined battered fleets, shared technology secrets, and struck a final deal. This was their long-shot gamble. Marshal all resources to trap and destroy the unstoppable craft. Makers refurbished old prototypes in secret fortified bunkers. Some foraged for a rumored planet-killer bomb. Others tried out black hole ammunition. Others pinned hopes on advanced warp inhibitors meant to freeze the unstoppable in place. But the fast pace of these projects led to expedited calibrations. Failure could be catastrophic, but no one saw another way. They could either stand or submit to an unending subjugation. Leaked transmissions indicated the Unstoppable was en route towards a critical star system that had been home to production yards for multiple factions. And by targeting there, humans could cut off supply lines for the entire region of the war zone. The newly minted alliance vowed to be interceptors, casting everything into one giant net. The formation of tens of thousands of ships radiated light minutes. If the flood of doom happened, it would be hit by crossfire of layers from everywhere. During frantic briefings, admirals preached cohesion. Rival captains exchanged suspicious glances, not used to cooperating so closely. There were no illusions. If the Unstoppable reached them again, it could lead to the surrender of their entire war zone to Earth's terms. Others even feared Earth could be in less danger than a future of misused superweapons triggering planetary meltdown. But fear drove them forward. In the tumbling dark of space near the production yards did the Allied fleets create a monstrous scale blockade. Lines were anchored by mile-long dreadnoughts bracketed by high-yield, torpedo-armed destroyers. Planetoid fortresses at the edge prepared gravity snares that could hinder the inexorable warp advantage. With a sense of readiness, for the first time, spread. They thought their unity could swing the balance. Days passed. Patrols scanned each vector. Tense comm channels were flashing minor alarms, but no confirmed sightings. The waiting drained nerves. Some feared the inevitable was coming from the skies, plotting from 35,000 feet for more spoiler-like Wednesdays. Morale wavered. And then, suddenly, sensor grids blared to life. This is a massive spike at the edge of the blockade. The Unstoppable had arrived. Steeling themselves, the entire alliance unleashed a preemptive volley, saturating the area with insurmountable beams and warheads. But the Invincible passed through an unseen gap in the blockade, moving deeper into the heart of the formation. Allied vessels raced to turn guns, scrambling. The pilot of the Unstoppable was not digging around. Rail cannons battered the biggest dreadnought until its shields failed in seconds. One more volley shattered the dreadnought's hull, sending shock waves through the Allied lines. Panic spread through the blockade. Some activated their planetoid fortresses that would entrap the formless and unending. Localized gravitational distortions surged, grasping at the local space-time continuum. For a moment, the Unstoppable slowed, shields strained spiking. There were cheers on Allied bridges. This might be their chance. A rain of coordinated fire pummeled the warship's shields. The hull of the Unstoppable flickered not far away, stealth field integrity lost, observers said. Then the warship's counter came. It blasted an energy wave that shorted vital distortion nodes, causing the carefully ordered gravitational cell to unravel. Released from the snare, it sped up again, zigzagging through chaos of other vessels. Allied vessels tried to pin it down with cross-lane fire, but there was confusion. The Untamed took scavenged gaps and exacted blinding vengeance. Frigates and cruisers erupted under accurate hits, each kill splintering the cohesion of the blockade. As doom loomed, the Alliance's final deterrent was activated. At some hidden station, a siege cannon, capable of siphoning star plasma, charged a massive beam, braced on course to intercept the Unstoppable. Others dashed out of the firing zone. It was also said to have the potential to vaporize Allied lines. But in desperation, they shot. A lance of sun-bright light sliced across the dark. In a moment, it enveloped the position of the Unrelenting. A hush fell. Did the Unstoppable vanish? The glare faded, revealing the battered but intact warship, its shield swirling with savage arcs of energy. The ever-dangerous had emerged unscathed from the Allied doomsday shot. Stunned silence reigned. Admiral voices, panic tightened, as the Unstoppable began moving again. An unstoppable force, unstoppable still. With that last gambit a bust, the Alliance began to crack. Crews wrestled for last-ditch moves that might save them a few seconds. But time had run out. The uncontainable power forward, swatting away the biggest threats like so much runaway junk. The Allied blockade that had once seemed unbreakable by any single enemy lay in tatters. A battered flagship's reactor going critical signaled the Alliance's collapse. But in the wild flames, the Unstoppable became unleashed, unrestrainable as before. The galaxy's final bid to restrain humanity's avatar had been a shambles, eclipsed by the unstoppable force that none dared oppose. With the Alliance defeated, the Unstoppable pushed forward to the war zone's beating heart, a strategic planet whose orbit served as the command nexus to all warring factions. This stronghold, encircled by fortress platforms, had never been captured, weathering centuries of conflict. But every sensor picket detected the Unstoppable's approach. Dens of desperation and desperate defenses. Even bloody survivors from the earlier fights limped over to help, ready to turn back the inevitable one last time. The ineluctably burst into the system at breakneck speed, unfazed by stray shrapnel. Orbital stations with their locks, filling the ether with killing beams. The missiles flew in parabolas that intersected at the warship's signature. But the shield of the Unstoppable glittered, deflecting or absorbing each wave. Meanwhile, the warship's pilot unleashed punishing rail salvos that perforated station hulls. Some stations exploded in fiery detonations, a precursor to another relentless barrage. Planet-based cannons attempted a coordinated layered response. Commanders underscore output hammered targeting grids that blended numerous firing solutions. They opened fire in synchronization, each blast fired precisely between the fractions of a second when their shields would be at their weakest. For a moment, the Unstoppable's shield flickered menacingly, threatening to buckle under weight of numbers alone. Tension ratcheted up among observers. Was this the time it could snap? But the Unstoppable adapted. In a sly maneuver, it adjusted shield frequencies in the middle of a volley. A few beams completely missed, ricocheting off new angles. The warship broke free of the trap and retaliated with fire from its main guns, targeting the largest orbital ring in the process. After the Unrelenting hammered home its power relays, the ring's structural integrity succumbed. Explosions roared through the rings, casting debris into its atmosphere. Below, the planet's surface armies looked on in dread. Their fate depended on lines tracing to space. When those lines fell, entire anti-air networks raced into action. Some fired ballistic missiles that exploded in low orbit, launching high-yield warheads against the imperceptible. The craft flew well beyond standard targeting arcs, launching a defensive interceptor that destroyed the missiles midair. Fireballs lit the sky, visible to every citizen cowering in fear. Megacorps deploy the ever-malleable vehicles of the Unstoppable to an air battle above the world's command station, and, drawing near the installation, the Unstoppable's final weapon is deployed, a massive energy lance. A beam of searing light pierced the station's superstructure, observers reported, setting fire to fuel storage in a chain reaction that lit up the hemisphere. The Unrelenting circled the sky above, searching for anything heat-signatured. The warships in orbit had been driven off or left to be derelict drifting hulks. Planetary bunkers meant surrender. In that fatal blow, the Irresistible ruptured the region's coordinating authority. The various factions now fighting in the war zone melted into confusion, deprived of their unifying command. Armadas that used to coordinate campaigns across star systems lost leaders. The undeterred maintained its orbit, scavenging remnants of defunct defensive mammoth corporates. No formal resistance existed anymore. With one last, unstoppable stroke, the war's fate was sealed. A silence fell across every corner of the war zone. Leaders of the aliens, sheltered in bunkers, safe at scattered outposts, knew that the unstoppable had prevailed. The shattered survivors make pleas to end the fighting, without preconditions. On battered front lines, disordered zones of combat yielded to a stunned silence. The demonstration of the unstoppable dispelled any illusions who now possessed the final advantage. Fatigued armies dropped weapons. Some conspirators wanted to disappear in the star lanes. Others thought the only path to survival of their species was to negotiate with Earth. The merchant convoys that had once been terrorized by warring fleets found their routes eerily open. Escaped from unceasing blockades, they negotiated through debris fields with care. Indefatigable, brilliant in the planet's orbit, the embodied a new age. Eventually, no longer receiving warlike responses, the unrelenting rose from low orbit. Observers caught sight of its hull scorched from several strikes, yet still formidable. That last blow had unraveled centuries of deadlock. In one campaign, humankind's champion restructured the power arrangements in the region. The warship's engines lit. It blinked into hyperspace or stealth, leaving a spiral of dust, blazing hulls into galaxy forever changed behind. Across every star system previously trapped in senescent warfare, an uneasy peace fell. The forces of the unstoppable interrupted the cycle of unending battles that had come at the cost of shattered fleets and ruined worlds. But many understood that the invincible also bludgeoned not only an empire, but the concept that human beings were small. Earth, beating will unbreakable into unyielding steel, had tilted cosmic scales. Now, the whole region had to contend with the same question: what rises from these ashes with humanity in charge? Days later, the war zone that had been an unstoppable action was quiet. Orbits were scattered with wreckage around disputed planets, relics of the bloody finale. Survivors from all factions converged in emergency summits, compelled to contend with common ruin. The old chaos was replaced by a hush as beleaguered admirals and beleaguered governors tried to put new arrangements in place. Humankind's rampage forced investments in the war economy to be crippled, entire fleets being unsavable. The Unstoppable's victory buzzed faster than light, to neutral enclaves, distant capitals. Reactions varied. For some, Earth was a liberator that toppled brutal campaigns. Still, remainders feared an unstoppable tyranny, afraid humans would use its newfound edge to enslave the region. And in the absence of clear pronouncements from Earth, speculation ran rampant. Delegations readied couriers in hopes of beseeching Earth for alliances or clarities. Civilians combed through rubble on devastated worlds, knowing no more airstrikes were to come. The immeasurable thrashed warmongers into unilateral disarmament, liberating peoples from roving aerial bombardment. Yet uncertainty reigned. If the Unstoppable came back, would it bring new rules? A lot of regular people celebrated that local wars were over, but the price was unspeakable. They watched entire towns wipe out thousands. There was peace, but settled by irresistible force. Where the remaining arms of fleets once contended with one another in pressured star lanes, a new peace settled. Pirates and smugglers, who have long flourished on chaos, ceased operations. The Unstoppable had displayed no tolerance for hostilities. Some smaller polities suspected Earth would soon dispatch envoys to craft a durable arrangement. Others feared a future of unavoidable ships and tribute. The legacy of the Unstoppable was a double-edged sword. Privately, certain powers conspired against it. They thought, if we pooled resources or distilled some secret of humankind, a countermeasure might be forged. Their scientists examined data from recordings of each confrontation, looking for a chink in the element that would not be stopped, or a means to jam its advanced systems. But the scale of devastation was a lot to bear. All could not overlook the rapid triumph of the unbeatable over all efforts. Perhaps some unity or craft sabotage would eventually turn the tables on Earth whenever that would be in the distant future, but there was no appetite for further defeats. It's unclear whether scattered messages reached the far-off colonies of Earth that the Unstoppable campaign had succeeded. Tattered alien dreadnoughts were pictured, their drifting hulks like war trophies, amid triumphant celebrations on Earth. Pride swelled at the success of the Unstoppable. But official spokespeople stayed mum, unwilling to publicly celebrate. They understood the inhabitants of the war zone suffered unfathomable losses. It would only produce envy and resentment. Earth may be unstoppable, but it nevertheless wanted to avoid characterizing itself as a ruthless usurper. Elsewhere, freshly liberated enclaves in the war zone rushed to establish stable governance. Some local officials started discreetly contacting Earth, asking for humanitarian assistance or trade relations. They prayed the unstoppable would aid reconstruction, not disappear. In the silence of battered command centers, the notion germinated that Earth, possessed of unstoppable power, could lead to rehabilitation and unite the region. Others, distrustful of hidden agendas, balked at the notion, always assuming that unstoppable force is matched by unstoppable ambition. Over time, the region's factions understood that fighting among themselves no longer made sense. The unstoppable washed away any local power struggles. The real question was if Earth would intervene more, or let them rebuild on their own. Ambassadors considered forging cooperative pacts with humankind, hoping to garner advanced tech or at least non-aggression treaties. In a wave of confusion, many assumed the unstoppable overthrew the old order forever. Afterward, historians would write of the moment a human warship stormed in and redirected the entire course of the war. They remembered how unstoppable beams tore down blockades once thought impregnable, how ancient enmities fell within a night, how entire fleets abandoned the field. There was a debate over whether humankind's show of force was a necessary act of deterrence or unstoppable aggression. The debate raged on, but none denied the world-stopping reality. From that moment on, the region's fate turned on the will of the Earth. As the dust settled, observers across the galaxy echoed the last of the nightmare. The unstoppable war machine could return if hostilities resumed. Freed from endless war, bruised factions faced the future with suspicion. Once humans were dismissed as the solution, they imposed an accelerated, irrepressible resolution. Whether that resolution turned into lasting peace or laid the foundation for a new conflict was an open question. But they all acknowledged one fact. Should a new war ever loom for these stars, the inexorable might could return, carving or obliterating an even more glorious chapter in the cosmic tale.